Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Yamag Nation News. The U.S. Real ID deadline nears. What is it, how to get one, and everything else you need to know. Starting May 7th, 2025, a new travel requirement will impact most Americans, as they will need a Real ID compliant driver's license or identification card to board domestic flights. This shift follows the Real ID Act of 2005, which aims to enhance security standards for state-issued identification documents. Initially set for 2020, the deadline was postponed due to pandemic delays, but the new enforcement date is firm, and individuals must meet the requirements by May 7th, 2025 to ensure they can continue to travel and access federal facilities. Starting May 7th, 2025, most Americans will need a Real ID-compliant driver's license or identification card to fly within the U.S. The Department of Homeland Security set this deadline as part of the Real ID Act of 2005, which established minimum security standards for state-issued identification. The original 2020 deadline was postponed due to pandemic backlogs at motor vehicle offices. This time, the deadline is firm. Federal agencies, including the Transportation Security Administration, will no longer accept non-compliant documents for air travel. The Real ID Act implemented a 9/11 Commission recommendation for standardized identification. According to DHS, the act sets standards for the issuance of sources of identification such as driver's licenses. Those over 18 without an alternative TSA-approved identification will need a Real ID. Acceptable alternatives include passports, passport cards, certain trusted traveler cards, Global Entry, Nexus Century, FAST, military IDs, and other specific documents. A full list is available on the TSA website. Real ID applicants should contact their state's driver's licensing agency to determine the exact required documentation. Generally, this includes proof of full legal name, date of birth, social security number, address, and legal status. Processing can take up to 2 weeks. Compliant cards will feature a state-specific marking in the corner. I don't know the regime to be completely safe, but I do. Here's everything you need to know about Real ID. When you need a Real ID, you will need a Real ID to access certain federal facilities, board federally regulated commercial aircraft, and enter nuclear power plants, according to the Department of Homeland Security. When will the Real ID requirement be enforced? The enforcement date is May 7th, 2025. Is there an alternative to a Real ID? According to DHS, enhanced driver's licenses issued by Washington, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Vermont are considered acceptable alternatives to Real ID compliant cards and will also be accepted for official Real ID purposes. Most EDLs do not contain the star marking, and this is acceptable. Are all states issuing Real ID cards? Yes, all states, the District of Columbia, and the 5 U.S. territories are Real ID compliant and are issuing Real ID compliant driver's licenses and IDs. How to get a Real ID? Visit your state's driver's licensing agency website to find out exactly what documentation is required to obtain a Real ID. At a minimum, you must provide documentation showing full legal name, date of birth, social security number, 2 proofs of address of principal resident, lawful status. Some states may impose additional requirements, so check with your state's driver's licensing agency website before visiting in person for further guidance and assistance. As the enforcement date approaches, it is essential for individuals to obtain a Real ID or alternative TSA-approved identification to avoid disruptions in air travel and federal facility access. Ensuring that all necessary documentation is in place will help individuals stay compliant and avoid delays. With all states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories issuing Real ID compliant IDs, now is the time to prepare for the deadline. That is all for today. In this video, what are your thoughts on this? Please let us know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching the entire video. Hopefully the information is useful to you. See you later in the next video. Till then, take care.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel US Immigration News. We hope you are doing great. The US Real ID deadline nears. What is it? how to get one, and everything else you need to know. Starting May 7, 2025, most Americans will need a real ID, compliant driver's license, or identification card to board domestic flights. These new requirements is a part of the Real ID Act of 2005, which sets minimum security standards for state-issued IDs. The original deadline for compliance was set for 2020 but was delayed due to pandemic-related delays in processing. The new deadline is affirmed, and after May 7, 2025, federal agencies including the Transportation Security Administration will no longer accept non-compliant documents for air travel. The Real ID Act was designated to address recommendation from the 9/11 Commissions, which advocated for standardized identification. The law applies to individuals over 18 years old who wish to fly or access certain federal facilities. Those without a Real ID compliant ID will need an alternative TSA approved a form of identification such as passport, military ID, or trusted traveler's card. Easy Global Entry, Nexus, Sentry, and Fast. A full list of acceptable alternatives is available on the TSA website. To apply for a Real ID, individuals must visit their state's driver's license agency and provide specific documentation. Generally, applicants will need to show their full legal name, date of birth, social security number, address, and proof of lawful status. Processing can take up to 2 weeks. Real ID compliant cards will feature a state-specific marking, typically a star in the upper corner to indicate they meet federal standard. Real IDs will be required for air travel, entry into certain federal buildings, to access nuclear power plants. These requirements will be enforced beginning May 7, 2025. However, enhanced driver's license issued by states such as Washington, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Vermont are considered acceptable alternatives to Real IDs. These EDLs are also valid for official purposes, even if they do not have the star marking. All states, the District of Columbia, and US territories are issuing Real ID compliant IDs. To obtain a Real ID, applicants should check with their state's driver's licensing agency to determine the exact documentation required. Most states require proof of full legal name, date of birth, social security number, to proof of address and lawful status. Some states may have additional requirements, so it is important to consult the agency website for specific guidelines. With the new enforcement date fast approaching, it's crucial for individuals to act soon to ensure they have the appropriate documentation for air travel and federal access by the deadline.